You have to be a bit patient with me. Okay, we're on live.
Good morning, and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and thanks for joining me this morning. Hopefully, we'll have some good conversations. With me today are our longtime friends on Twitter, Eugene Weixel and Georgia Davenport of Hull, Washington. And Georgia is here to talk about Hull, Washington's movie Healing Us. Eugene is here to listen and participate, and then later in the show, we're going to talk a little bit about Venezuela. If anybody has any questions about anything that Georgia or Eugene says as we go along, please feel free to pop it in the chat. That's why it's here. Sometimes I even remember to bring it up. So please feel free to participate.
I have a lot.
Sorry, Eugene. How are you today? Go ahead.
I'm doing okay. You know that a couple of weeks ago I had an operation for prostate cancer.
I remember.
Yeah. So
I'm glad you're with us.
Yeah. It's. I don't feel the greatest, but I feel a whole lot better than I did 2 weeks ago.
I bet.
Every day is getting better, and this actually participating in this is kind of a landmark for me.
That's good.
Personally, that I was able to. I put together a whole bunch of links for people who have questions. They can go to my Twitter at Eugene Projectil. That's EUGENEPROJECTIL on Twitter. And they could DM me and I can send all kinds of links that back up things that I'm going to say.
Sounds good. And feel absolutely free to put those in the private chat too. I can copy and paste those into the general chat. Feel free to put any links you want in the general chat for that matter.
I don't know how to do it.
Fair enough. So if you look on the right side of the screen, there's a chat window here with comments at the top and private chat at the bottom on the far right. Private chat lets you put something in the room that me and Georgia can see and that I can paste into the general chat. And comments lets you just put something right in the general chat.
Comments. Am I still there?
Yeah, we're all still here.
Okay.
Oh. Did he leave the?
Okay, so Georgia, while we're waiting on Eugene to head back in, go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about Hull, Washington a little.
Yeah. Actually, I'm here on behalf of the Healing Us Network today. We about a few years ago.
I don't think I'm going to be able to work that. I'm going to have to.
Fair enough.
Do it another way.
Fair enough. Go ahead and send it to me on Twitter.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead, Georgia.
That's fine. Yeah. So a few years ago, I'm not sure the exact date now. Laura Fielding, who's the founder of Red Berets for Medicare for All, went on a podcast, and somebody who listened to the podcast, Kenny Valentine, was so inspired by the craftivist strategy that he contacted Laura and asked if she would be interested in having a documentary started about the efforts to get universal health care through a kind of dual strategy. We support Medicare for All. That's obviously like our number one priority, is getting Medicare for All passed nationally. We've been to hearings. We've called our Congress people so many times to get them to co-sponsor the bills, organize rallies, that sort of thing. But we also work on state legislation. And Hull, Washington is one of the many, many organizations that's working on state legislation. They've had 3 initiatives, and they have a bill in the legislature currently. So, Laura and Kenny Valentine started working on this great documentary. And what is unique about the film, there's been a lot of healthcare films, but what I think is unique about this particular healthcare film is its voices from all across the United States talking about their personal experiences and why we need universal healthcare. And I mean, the diversity of these voices range from like a conservative in Utah who was a public health official and has written several books, Dr. Joe Jarvis. And we have an NFL player, Justin Jackson, Dr. Dooley, Scott Desnoyer from New York. Yes. Just like a broad range of voices of people who are not only telling their healthcare stories about why we need to pass Medicare for all, but also just like doctors talking about their experiences in the current system and how it's inefficient and ineffective, and how they're not able to treat their patients the way that they want to treat them because there's so many restrictions with private healthcare and that sort of thing. So I'm really, really excited because we are having the grand premiere, the world premiere in Tacoma this upcoming Friday, actually. So, oh, and I forgot to mention, amazingly, Healing Us is narrated by Susan Sarandon, so that's pretty cool too.
That is pretty cool, actually. I know that she's been a big supporter of the Red Berets in the past, so that makes sense.
Yes, and done a lot of actions for Medicare for All and that sort of thing. So we're really, really excited to actually be able to launch the film in many different cities coming up, but immediately coming up is Tacoma with a world premiere on Friday. So I had put in the private chat, but I guess I should have put it in the comments, the link to buy tickets. It's the healingus.network.com. And then following that on Saturday is a free showing in Seattle. So anybody who's listening in Washington State, there's 2 showings coming up. So that's really, really exciting. I'm on the east side of Washington, so I'm driving Thursday to Tacoma for the world premiere. So
and folks, that link that Georgia mentioned is in the comments now. So feel free to check it out.
Yeah, and the other great thing about this movie that I think is unique is that a lot of times people think that we're going to vote our way into getting universal health care or Medicare for all. And I think that the film definitely identifies a strategy that I think personally is the right way to go, which is people-powered, and calling out elected officials from both parties who are blocking it. Because, for example, here in Washington State, we think this is like some sort of liberal mecca. It is democratically run in both 3, areas of the government. But if you look at the healthcare chairs for the Senate and the House, they're both Democrats, and they've both blocked single-payer legislation for decades. And if you look at their PDC reports, which I actually have one up for the senator of the Washington State Healthcare Committee, and I'll paste that into the comments. You can see that she's taking thousands of dollars from political action committees, medical political action committees, Pfizer, just basically the same corporations that do not want us to pass universal health care. So it's no coincidence to me that, and I'll say her name, Senator Annette Cleveland, has never let our bill out of committee.
It's the same here in Oregon. I mean, people talk about what a progressive city Portland is, but our cops are people who text with Nazis during crowd control operations and get caught. And then when the police chief loses their job over it, the police chief and they just get hired in Philadelphia. That's the world we live in. It's not as progressive a city as people think. It's not like Oregon has universal health care. Now, to be fair, Oregon does have a really good state Medicaid plan, and I have to give it lots of props. When I still qualified for Medicaid, it was the best Medicaid plan I've ever had. But that said, lots of people don't qualify for Medicaid. And in some states, not all the doctors take Medicaid. And that's not enough. But yeah, no, that people talk about this part of the country like it's progressive. California, Oregon, Washington. These are the places where the mayors are chasing the homeless people out of town.
Just like New York.
Yeah, how progressive is that? People talk about New York being a progressive city. Look at Eric Adams.
Yep. I'm a lifetime New Yorker. I moved to Richmond less than 2 years ago, and I was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, in 1960. I guess it was 1968.
Wow.
Yeah. I have very fond memories of Seattle, but it's probably changed a lot.
Yeah, Seattle has changed a lot just in the last. Well, in the 90s, everybody was moving up there from Los Angeles. Now everybody's moving to Oregon from San Francisco. So that always changes things.
Yeah. I remember it's the Smith Tower, right? In Seattle. That was the tallest building in Seattle.
Yeah, I live north of Spokane, so I'm on the other side of the state, across the mountains. So, I mean, I've been to Seattle a lot, but I'm not too familiar with the buildings and that sort of thing.
I think of the Space Needle when I think of Seattle, but yeah, Smith Tower.
I had friends in Seattle. I was also kind of active as what they used to call an anti-war GI.
Yeah. Smith Tower is the oldest skyscraper
if it would be
in
possible.
Seattle.
I know I asked in the chat. Is there a way to just watch the preview? It's pretty short.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and see if we can share that. Actually.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Present. Share screen. Yes, I know it's easiest. All right. Entire screen. Can everybody see?
Now I see it.
Perfect.
Healing us.
Perfect. Good. All right. Here we go.
We are governed in American healthcare by the for-profit interests.
In a typical year in modern America, approximately 68,000 people will die due to lack of adequate health care.
Health insurance companies are in the business to make money, and they will do whatever they can to avoid paying claims.
The fallout is they would rather make a sale than take care of a patient.
If me and Danny lived in Canada, if me and Danny lived in Mexico, me and Danny would still be living in Canada or Mexico.
They're not just numbers, they're people. They're ripped from us because of our greedy healthcare system that puts profits before people.
This is a profit-driven business. They can be sued if they are not acting in the best interest of their shareholders, not in the best interest of the patients.
So the problem is greed.
The Democrats and the Republicans are both in the pockets of Big Pharma and the insurance lobby.
You're at a real tipping point.
The people in this country know the system is broken.
It's time for change.
Yeah, so I think the end definitely encompasses one of my favorite things about the film is that it's time for change, and the film outlines what we need to do, the strategies that we can take to pass universal health care. I find a lot of the media that I watch, also even just social media on Twitter, there's a lot of like complaining about the system we have now, but there's not a lot of solutions that I hear from people. We get these big accounts that are like, we need Medicare for all. Here's the reason why we need Medicare for all. But then there's no like call to action. And this film is a call to action, what we can do to actually get these pieces of legislation passed.
And that's important because a lot of people don't think they can really do anything but vote. That's what the media tells people all the time. You can't really do anything but vote and maybe protest the right way a little, but only a little, and it has to be the right way.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Always on the weekend. You can't disrupt anything. And that's not the way things ever
Can't
change.
do anything in front of a judge's or politician's house because that's scary and mean and they might feel bullied.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I just think that, imagine if we went to the effort to protect individual Americans to the degree that we go to the effort to protect politicians from the public. And the idea that politicians need to be protected from the public itself suggests a failing in our politics.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, and they work for us. They should be answerable.
Do they, though? I know they say it all the time, and the media says it all the time, but do politicians really work for us? Or are they working for those people that are paying them?
Yeah, you're right. I should have rephrased it. They're supposed to be working for us, but we need to hold them accountable. They're not some rock stars that we need. I mean, I don't really feel like we should idolize rock stars either, but I feel like we do that a lot with politicians. We treat them they're celebrities and they're like above critique, and we need to respect them and that sort of thing. But if, as the movie points out, tens of thousands of people are dying every year and they're allowing it to happen, that they don't deserve our respect after that, in my opinion. If they were trying to work for change, then yes, maybe we can give them some respect. But at this point, like, I'm so done with the kissing up.
Now this is Laura Fielding, who appeared in the movie. She was speaking in our little trailer there. It's powerful and beautiful in that way, yes. It shows the historical context of how real change has always been people-powered, which is true. Mm-hmm. The only time, even political reform, only happens when people are scared. Mm-hmm. And when I say people, I'm lying because I mean politicians, so sorry. Mm-hmm. But politicians have to be scared of people for good things to happen. It's disturbing, but it's true. And when they have this system to protect themselves from us, they feel no reason to be scared of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're too comfortable right now. I agree. Mm-hmm.
And the whole system tells us partial truths and half-truths about the world we live in. How it's really so great to be in America, so just ignore the fact that the cops are sweeping up homeless people and the health insurance companies are refusing to pay people's medical bills.
Well, talking about homeless people, that case in New York, that poor guy, his last name was Neely.
Jordan Neely.
Jordan Neely. You have to forgive me. I'm both hard of hearing and I sometimes have senior moments.
Well, I know the feeling, actually. I have short-term memory loss, I believe is the medical term. And I get frustrated and can't talk, too. So there's that.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that case in New York is a good example because there are people who are trying to say that someone who killed a homeless guy on a subway is some sort of good Samaritan. I mean, that's insane.
It's totally insane.
My apologies to fellow people with mental health diagnoses. I should not have used that word. It boggles the mind.
Yeah, I mean, the parable is about a person who is of a different religion who helps someone, not kills them. It's completely wild that they're using that as a descriptor for a person. It definitely boggles the mind.
Yeah, that's just so. That was just, even seeing those words used in that manner is disturbing. And the actual Good Samaritans end up killed. We had a case here in Portland just before I moved here, where a white supremacist was harassing Muslim teenagers on our train. And a couple of genuine Good Samaritans were standing up for the teenagers, and the white supremacist stabbed them, and 2 of them died, and the 3rd went to the hospital. And it's just, when actual Good Samaritans do something, they get punished, whether by the person who they're trying to protect people from, or like in the case of Mike Reinele, also here in Portland, who was another real Good Samaritan who saved protesters from an armed Nazi. They get murdered. Sorry, that's
true.
That's my soapbox for the day. But yeah, so I mean, we really have to take that power back, but we also have to understand that there are protesters being charged as terrorists right now as we speak in multiple cities for protesting against cops or protesting against oil companies.
Yep.
And yet we can't have things like healthcare. You know, it's not even the European countries that people talk about all the time. It's not even Canada and Mexico, just Canada and Mexico. You know, Samoa and Uruguay have universal health care. If Samoa and Uruguay can do universal health care, why can't the United States? Now, in Samoa, universal health care may mean an emergency flight to New Zealand in some cases, but it's still covered.
Yeah, here in Eastern Washington, I have to get this extra insurance called Life Flight, just because so many providers have had to shut their doors due to the fact that private insurance companies decided a couple of years back that it's just too expensive to cover people in rural areas, maybe because we have more health issues, whatever the reason, the profit margin wasn't large enough. So because there aren't enough providers in this area or insurance coverage options in this area, providers are shutting their doors. So that means that someone who is in a rural area like myself needs to get life flight insurance so that if something happens and you're too far from the provider, which I am currently, a helicopter can come pick me up in a really bad situation and take me to the closest provider. So that's an extra cost.
So I have to speak up now. I am reminded once again of how our life has become a cyberpunk dystopia. There's a game, a tabletop role-playing game called Shadowrun, which is sort of half cyberpunk and half fantasy and is completely weird. But what matters is that in this Shadowrun game, there is a private contractor called Dockwagon who have helicopters that will come and pick you up if you have a medical emergency and take you to the hospital. And people pay lots of money for these Dockwagon contracts for the ambulance to come and fly them to the hospital in an emergency so that they can get care fast enough. And that's what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about another insurance policy for the helicopter to fly you to the hospital. So something that's a dystopian future in a game from the 1980s is real now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you don't have that insurance and you do get life flighted, because you're not going to be able to, in cases like this, you won't be able to say, no, I don't have life flight insurance. Please don't take me to the hospital. You're in desperate need and probably unconscious. So they'll fly you anyways, and then they'll
charge you. But let's think about the option. I mean, I really wouldn't want to say, don't fly me to the hospital because I don't want to die.
Some people refuse ambulances.
Well, I understand that. If I've been tempted to refuse ambulances in the past. One of the things I really like here in Oregon is at least here in Tigard, the fire department sends actual paramedics every time anybody calls for an ambulance, and the ambulance company isn't allowed to do anything until the paramedics tell them it's okay. But things like that aside, and yes, people do turn down ambulances for that reason, we're going to get to the point where people won't need to turn down ambulances because at some point there's going to be a barcode, and the barcode on the 911 call tells the people in the ambulance whether the person has ambulance insurance or not. And if we don't have ambulance insurance, the ambulance won't take us to the hospital anyway. We're going to get there.
Yes.
So
there's this whole thing about there being too many people.
Yes, it's not true, but it won't go away. The whole the myth of overpopulation. Billionaires love the myth of overpopulation because it lets them off the hook.
Yeah, and as things regress, they actually don't need as many people as they used to.
That's really what they mean when they say that there's too many people. They mean that we don't want to have to give up wealth to take care of people who aren't doing work for us.
That's right.
It's this whole notion of wanting to get rid of people who consume their resources. And they tell themselves that it's for the good of the whole society, that society will be better off. But what they really mean is they'll stay rich.
Yep. And then you have the anti-maskers that parade as leftists. These people really get to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, it all fits together. So it's interesting how it all fits together. And this is a good place where it segues into some of the Venezuela stuff too, because this is where the way we do stuff on our border and the way we do our foreign policy starts to figure in.
Yes.
But there's this idea that started, weirdly enough, from what I would call the far right of the Green movement. The scholarship started in the 1950s, but the advocacy started getting really loud in the 60s and 70s. It started with a book by a man named Paul Ehrlich called The Population Bomb.
I remember that.
Which was the idea that India would not be able to feed its own population because of the cost of importing food and the inability of the crops that had solved hunger in the West to grow in India. Is this very, very myopic and Western-centered analysis in the first place. And then he goes along to say, and the consequences of this are there's going to be large starvations in India, big famines. We will never be able to do anything about it. And to solve this problem, we have to actually focus on doing something about the population. Paul Ehrlich would go on to found an organization called Zero Population Growth,
Right.
with people like Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring. The folks who pushing this are some of the biggest names in what we think of as the liberal green movement. The author of Silent Spring, Sir David Attenborough, is big into population control and European-centered conservation policies. It's just grotesque. And it spread. It started as this sort of fringe right-wing idea in a small environmental movement. And it became extremely powerful because, of course, billionaires are much more friendly to the idea that there are just too many people and we have to stop the population from growing than they are to the idea that we need to change the way we distribute our resources. And maybe we can't afford to have rich people.
Well, that's the truth.
This figures into healthcare too, because if you have universal healthcare, that means fewer people die because they can't afford healthcare. Fewer people say no to the ambulance. Fewer people say no to care at the emergency room. Fewer people say, no, check me out, when the hospital wants to check them in. And all of that, in the minds of the Wall Street capital manager, cost money. And because that costs money, Wall Street makes less money, and the rich people that Wall Street services make less money. And Wall Street becomes less necessary. Every time you privatize an industry, every time you take something that should be done by society and you give it to corporate government to run instead, you're creating this system by which people who can't afford a service don't get it. And as a result, eugenics happens without the government having to do anything because more people just die.
Yep.
You don't have to round people
Well,
up.
I think that's what's behind this whole COVID is over nonsense.
It figures into it. One of the presidents of Zero Population Growth for a little while was a guy named John Tanton, who started out as the chapter of his local Sierra Club in a little town in Michigan you've never heard of, and went on to found the biggest anti-immigrant organization in the United States. And so you've got this person who comes from this place that starts with, there are too many people, and wealthy people in the global north shouldn't have to lose their lifestyle because there are too many people. So we need to get rid of the poorest people by not helping them. And it'll just naturally take care of itself. And the anti-immigration part comes in because if you look at the exploited part of the country, people are dying more in places like Venezuela even than they are in the U.S. And closing the U.S. border and keeping them from being able to get here, or making it more likely for them to die while they try to get here, is another way to decrease that surplus population, in the words of Ebenezer Scrooge.
Yes.
Because there's a line in Dickens we should all remember. It's how rich people think. The the gentlemen who are coming to ask Scrooge to give to their society for Christmas, so the poor and the homeless can have a Christmas dinner, say, but we want to be able to give the poor a Christmas dinner. They deserve a holiday. They're poor. They don't have anywhere else to go. And Scrooge says, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Are the treadmill and the Poor Act not still in effect? Talking about the horrible British welfare system at the time, which basically made people work themselves to death in order to get what we would call food stamps now. They had to live in the workhouse and work themselves nearly to death in order to be able to eat and have a home. Because their kids could get jobs, but they couldn't. So you think about this, and then the gentlemen say some of them cannot go, and some of them would rather die. And Scrooge says flat out, if they had rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. And in Canada now, they have a program called Medical Assistance in Dying, which exists to help poor people kill themselves.
Yes.
Now, they're not helping poor people pay their bills or support their families or get health care beyond the normal programs for everyone. Yes, Canada has a universal health care system, but it's not perfect.
Neither is Medicare.
Neither is Medicare. It's true. Rather than do more to help the people who need the most help, they've got a system to help the people who need the most help kill themselves.
Yep.
And it's depressing because even as imperfect as charity is, and Johnny is right, charity is part of the Puritan system to reach atonement for attaining too much wealth to enter the kingdom of heaven. Which, and you know, Dickens was kind of a Puritan. Some of the best British moralists were Puritans, which means they have a downside too. But Charles Dickens did have the good sense to spit at the U.S. Congress on his one visit to the United States near the end of his life. So that's something.
That's good.
He didn't literally spit at Congress, but he spit at the messenger who said that Congress wanted him to speak.
I don't know how to talk about Venezuela, how to get started talking about that.
So here's a good segue. There are several reasons that people are trying to get out of Venezuela. The biggest one, of course, is sanctions. And sanctions always hurt the poorest people in any country first. So when people talk about why sanctions in Iraq or Syria or Venezuela are bad, the biggest thing they're talking about is we're not hurting our enemies. When Max Blumenthal wanted to prove that sanctions weren't hurting anybody in Venezuela, he didn't go to a poor neighborhood. He went to one of the richest neighborhoods in the country.
I have like this. I can't even describe what I feel about that man.
Well, I think it's interesting that his idea of supporting Venezuela
is to deny that they have problems.
Yes. His idea, and even if you let's say just take the bare bones anti-imperialist position that we're going to interrogate a little bit later and take it on face value. So Venezuela is a good socialist country and the U.S. is an evil imperialist country. So why would I want to help the good socialist country by going to a rich neighborhood and denying that sanctions are hurting them? And then that raises the question, why is there a rich neighborhood in a good socialist country?
And it raises the question, why is he such an anti-masker, an anti-vaxxer?
It really does, because it all fits together, like we were just
And
saying.
in the LaRouche orbit now.
Yes. And for those who don't know who Lyndon LaRouche was, Lyndon LaRouche was a so-called leftist who also worked as a Wall Street consultant during his most left days, and then who started an operation jointly with the FBI called Operation
Mop Up.
Operation Mop Up, yes. Operation Mop Up, to go beat up members of the Communist Party of the United States and the Socialist Workers' Party, to break up their meetings and keep them from organizing. People were coming to meetings with baseball bats and nunchucks and trying to beat people up. It was a wild time.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so that is...
I'm trying to bring something up on... I have another phone here, and I'm trying to bring something up that I want to read to you.
Sure.
But go ahead.
So, but yeah, that does make me wonder about Max Blumenthal and some other people. And the fact that Max Blumenthal's way of looking at the world and the LaRoucheites' way of looking at the world are so compatible is very coincidental, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Or it isn't.
But
who was his father?
Oh, Sidney Blumenthal.
That's right.
Sidney Blumenthal is on the DNC.
Yep.
He was a member of I hate it when I can't talk. He was a member of Clinton's original campaign for president in 1992. He's the establishment. And Max Blumenthal is able to go on, is able to make a living being so anti-establishment and saying that anti-establishment right-wingers are our friends too, believe me, because his bills are paid by the establishment and have been all his life. But, you know, I'm just sitting here with a tiny little YouTube channel and no money and a day job, trying to get people to talk about sanctions and universal health care. And rich people want to hijack that to have a conversation about whether or not it's bad for kids to mask and whether or not we have the right to beat people up for masking in front of us. Really silly stuff.
Yeah. I'm having a bit of a problem, but let me tell you what I wanted to read to you. I could really sum it up.
Sure.
Okay, first of all, I've been to Venezuela twice. The first time I went there, I went with my wife, who had been an undocumented immigrant. And she had two daughters that were here, and she had 4 sons in Venezuela. The first time I went down there was in 2006. In 2006, she had not been there for 10 years. And she was kind of blown away in a lot of ways by how plump people were. Because when she was there, before Chavez, just about everyone she knew was underweight, including herself. And where am I going with this now? Oh yeah, so the second time I went to Venezuela was in November of 2014, and I stayed there till February 2015. 3 months, 90 days exactly. And we traveled from the state of Vargas, which is near the Caracas airport, all the way to Táchira, which is on the Colombian border, where most of my wife's people are. And we stayed most of the time in Táchira. We spent a couple of weeks in Vargas, and most of the time in Táchira, which is on the border of Colombia. On the way there, we stopped in this beautiful city called Mérida. I'm going to move out of the sun. I'm in a garden where I live. Hold on a second.
No problem.
Better in the shade.
It gets a little warm in this.
So anyway, what I wanted to say is we stopped in this really beautiful city called Medellin, which is in the Andes, and they have a zoo there. It's not like an enormous zoo, but it's what's the best word I could use? It's sufficient. It's a big city zoo. It's got a lot of exhibits. It's got animals. It's got fish. It's got all kinds of wildlife. And outside of there was a building, and the building had a mural of Chavez on one side and Maduro on the other side. And I stood between them, and I wanted to share the snapshot with you all, but I don't know how to do it. But I stood between the two, and I wrote in a piece that I think I put on Medium, where this was before the sanctions. Before the sanctions, there was a so-called Barrio Adentro clinic to my right, and this was Monday afternoon, and it was padlocked. And the people that we were traveling with a guy who's a taxi driver and a guy who's a truck driver across Venezuela. And they said to me that Barrio Adentro is a joke, that it doesn't really function. And this is the thing that leftists here will rave about and talk about how they've got medical care in Venezuela, blah, blah, blah. They don't. And the public health system is collapsing. It was collapsing before the sanctions, and it's worse now. And what I wanted to talk about was this article by this Colonel, just a second. Damn it. You have to forgive me.
No, I understand.
It's Colonel Gavira. And I'll send you, he's still on Twitter, and I'll send you his Twitter. He had grown up in Táchira, as a matter of fact, and he was assigned to I guess it's a battalion that was guarding a strategic dam in Venezuela, and he had set up a model farm so that the enlisted soldiers could learn how to learn about agriculture. And they were growing cocoa for chocolate, and they were making chocolate. And Newsweek Español came and interviewed him, and they wanted to talk to him about the farm, or at least supposedly they wanted to talk to him about the farm. But there were a few people who had followed his Twitter, and he had been very critical of the government all the way back to 2010. And he was still in the army. And he just tore into them. He said, how is it possible that a colonel on a colonel's salary visits Disney World 20 times? How can that be? And how is it that when he presented his plans to everyone above him, for this model farm. Everyone shook their heads yes, and they didn't give him a damn penny. And he bought the seeds out of his own pocket to get started.
And
this became so he just really tore into them. And you have to know something about the military in Venezuela. There are 2,000 generals in Venezuela. You know how many generals and admirals in Venezuela? 2,000. You know how many there are in the United States military?
How many?
653.
That's telling, isn't it? And the United States military is a major worldwide organization.
So what that means is that an officer who does what he's supposed to do and doesn't rock the boat gets to retire as a general.
That makes sense.
Which in the United States, it's more typically a colonel.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense, and that's why, yeah. And
so he's never going to be a general. He says right now he'll never be a general. And it's interesting because he was locked up, and there was a big uproar on Twitter by Venezuelans. And I think he was in jail for 2 weeks, and they let him out.
Wow. You see, you can actually make people let people go if you make enough noise.
Yep.
If they're scared of you. Now, on that note, Georgia is, as Laura has been reminding us in the chat, an important person with many things to do to help promote a movie and Healing Us Network. So go ahead and just remind everybody one more time where they can find the movie and what to do if they want to see it.
Yeah, on a typical Sunday, I wouldn't have like time pressure, but since it's Mother's Day, we actually invited some people over for Mother's Day. So thank you so much for having me on the show. If anybody wants to see the film or watch the preview again, you can look for upcoming events on healingusnetwork.com. And that's where you can also watch previews. I believe there's a pretty substantive YouTube channel that you can go to and see all the different clips from different people who were in the film. So thanks again for having me on, Chris. I really appreciate it.
It's really my pleasure. Thanks for coming on, Georgia. Folks, the link is in the chat one more time. Remember, that is Healing Us. The world premiere is coming up in Tacoma. If you're in the Seattle-Tacoma area, or you can get there without too much trouble, please check it out. Otherwise, watch the website for when it's going to be coming closer to you. Thanks for joining us.
Eugene.
Take care.
You too. Bye, Chris.
Bye, Georgia. Sorry about that, Eugene. I just wanted to be able to get her out.
No. That's the more important part of this thing, I think.
Well, I think it's good that people have an understanding that the world... So there are two things that are true at the same time, and people have to understand both. There is the big picture, and in the big picture, yes, the U.S. is an evil empire that tries to do its will against the rest of the world, and it is generally good to oppose the U.S. throwing its weight around, bullying other countries, and making them heel its party line. At the same time, not every country that the United States targets is morally superior because the U.S. is targeting them. Every country has its own problems. Many of the problems in Venezuela are the manufacture of the United States and the governments that the United States has maintained in Venezuela over the years. And the good things that happened in Venezuela happened in a relatively short time frame by comparison, were often more things that the military was doing than things that the government was doing. And one of the things that should be remembered is that there were more radical socialists in the Venezuelan military who thought Chavez should overthrow the liberal republic and install a more socialist state, and Chavez was resistant to the idea. We need to understand and admit that Venezuela isn't a perfect model of socialism. They have rich neighborhoods that aren't harmed by the sanctions.
It's not any kind of model of socialism.
Exactly. It's a country that has an opportunistic government that for a little while was moving in a progressive direction. It's important to understand that Maduro has been trying since coming into power to make nice with the U.S. world order and being rebuffed.
Exactly, and that's what people don't understand. And he's meeting now. They're having meetings with the far right coup parties.
Yeah.
In Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And what they want to do is actually divvy up the spoils.
Well, I mean, and that's really what it comes down to for any ruling class system. That's what's happening in the United States. It's just not as obvious, and we're further removed from it because it's such a big and relatively rich country. But when you have a poor country, the rich and poor divide is worse because the rich have more of the resources. And as we were talking about with healthcare, the rich don't ever want to give resources up. You have to take them. And if the state is not willing to take the resources of the rich, you don't have socialism. You can't have wealth and socialism in the same place at the same time. Now you can have transitional systems. You can be trying to achieve socialism. You can be trying to be doing something about your wealth. But I mean, even if that's what you're doing, let's call it that. Let's not pretend that it's not still a liberal Republican system whose election monitors are calling it democratic and honest under liberal Republican definitions. Remember, these same organizations have frequently called American elections democratic in the past. I
call it a lumpen bourgeois government.
That's a good way to look at it. It's an attempt to make populist noises while not really changing much.
And I really want to challenge this idea that almost all the problems of Venezuela are from the sanctions. I really want to challenge that. And Gavira challenged it in his interview. Because he gave that interview before the sanctions.
Well, and I think
there were look, when I was there were food shortages.
Yeah.
There were very long lines to get into food stores, and you couldn't find things. And this was before the sanctions.
Yes. And it's not because
and you also have to remember that
Republicans want you to believe.
You have to also remember that the United States Justice Department has indicted Maduro, indicted Cabello, and a whole bunch of generals and ministers of the Venezuelan government for money laundering and narco trafficking.
Well, I mean,
and that indictment is 2 years old, and for some reason you don't hear about it in the media at all.
Well, I believe, and I could be wrong about this, I believe the biggest reason for the money laundering charges is about ways to help the capital class in Venezuela try to get around sanctions and get their capital into Western. Notice I didn't say Venezuela or the Venezuelan people. I said the Venezuelan capital to get around sanctions. Because that's what that when you're talking about money laundering in any context of a country against what we have sanctions, that means that's a country where we're stopping them from doing all the things all the other rich people in the world do in the United States.
Well, I would put this challenge out. Iran sends food to Venezuela.
Yes.
Is Iran under sanctions?
Yes. Iran is under sanctions.
The DPRK makes nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Is the DPRK under sanctions?
Yes, they are.
Why is it then that Venezuela can't feed its people?
That's a very good question, and it's a good question to ask. Why were they having a problem feeding their people before the sanctions? And
yeah, well, I got kicked out of a communist Facebook group for asking that.
Well, and I mean, and you look at what other countries are doing. And again, I'm not going to say Cuba's perfect. Cuba has its own problems too. The biggest
Cuba
problem
is another example. Yes.
The biggest problem you have in any socialist system is that if the state structure that you've got in place is not directly responsible to the people in very important ways, then the language of democracy ends up being repression and riots. Now, I'm not saying that repression and riots cannot be very democratic in their own way if the rioters win, which does sometimes happen in places like Cuba. And Cuba, when that happens, it happens because Cuba has to be responsive to those pressures in a way that the United States doesn't. And all of that needs to be kept in mind instead of just idealizing Cuba. There are good things that one can say about Cuba. There are bad things one can say about Cuba. There's no good nation state.
Yeah, but you can't put Cuba and Venezuela in the same basket.
No, you can't. You really can't, because if Cuba is socialist, then Venezuela isn't by Cuba's standard.
Well, it's a gangster state more than anything.
And this is a good place
and
to
Cuba
ask.
Is not.
It's very true. And how were these gangster states created historically?
It's hard to say. I think I don't know. Well, I mean, corruption goes way back in Venezuela.
Yes, it
does. Not that the United States is in any way pure.
No.
But,
well, and it's fair to say that the United States has always been on the side of corruption in Latin America. That doesn't mean that the opponents of the United States are not corrupt too. It just means that the United States has always been on the side of a certain kind of corruption in Latin America, the kind of corruption that benefits America. And they're opposed to the kind of corruption they think doesn't benefit America. And that's all there is to it as far as U.S. foreign policy goes.
I don't know.
But no, I mean, I think it is important to understand that you have this history of alliances.
Chavez put his bodyguard in charge of the Treasury.
Yes.
And he ended up in Florida in jail.
Yeah.
Chavez put his nurse in charge of the Treasury. She ended up in jail. You see where this is going?
It's not. It's all part of the same politics as usual, and the United States is not targeting it because it's good. the United States is targeting Venezuela because it benefits us somehow, not because Venezuela is some paragon.
Well, I think now they're trying to ease up the targeting of Venezuela.
Well, that's the thing, is you're hearing talks where Venezuela is talking about. Venezuela has been very helpful, despite rhetoric not at all supportive of the war. Venezuela has been very helpful managing U.S. and European oil prices.
Yes, if Venezuela were pumping at 3 million barrels a day, the prices would be in the floor.
Yeah.
And they used to pump 3 million barrels a day.
Yep. And it's worth noting that whatever one thinks of the Venezuelan government, that even under the best light, it was the idea that they could fund social programs with oil profits while driving down the price of oil was never fully thought out.
I think they bought that peak oil stuff.
I think so.
Okay, they had I can't remember the man's name. This is where my senior moment comes in. He was in charge of the oil industry, both the Ministry of Oil and the oil company PDVSA. Raphael somebody. Anyway, he took over the industry right after there had been like an oil strike lockout by management and highly technical workers trying to overthrow Chavez right after the coup.
Yes.
And they destroyed the oil industry.
I remember that.
And this man came in. Damn it, I can't remember his name. Raphael somebody. He came in and brought them back up to almost 3 million barrels a day. And he criticized Maduro for something, and Maduro put him first in charge of foreign ministry. Then he put him in as UN ambassador, and then he like disowned him and said that he was a traitor and corrupt, and that he had to go to jail and so forth. And the guy's Raphael, damn it, he's in Italy now. And where was I going with this? Anyway, my point is that yes, I think it's very possible that
Raphael
Raphael Ramirez. He's on Twitter too, as is
the U.S.
Colonel
let me see. Venezuela is still trying to get him extradited. Italy is rejecting requests by Venezuela for the extradition.
That's right. Then you have Luisa Ortega. That's another one. Luisa Ortega was in charge of the Ministry of Justice. And when the right-wing insurrection started in 2017, she made a bad bet. She bet that that the insurrection was going to win. So all of a sudden they discovered that she had been corrupt all those years, and all her shopping trips to Paris became known as if they were secret.
Which raises an interesting question, and one that I find extremely applicable to American politics as well. Why were they only worried about her corruption when she backed the other side?
Well, it's obvious she was one of the gang.
Exactly.
But she thought that they were going down, and like a rat, she jumped the ship.
Ruling class politics.
So,
see, what people sometimes don't understand is the U.S. has had so much influence, and I'm going to get on my soapbox here. I am going to blame the U.S. for some stuff because it goes back a long way, and it's useful to understand how and why the U.S. got its hooks into parts of that part of the world in the first place. You hear about Colombia all the time. You used to hear about Colombia all the time in the 80s because of the drug war. But let's remember that the reason that the United States had the Panama Canal is because Teddy Roosevelt intervened in a civil war in Colombia on the side of separatists in Panama and Venezuela to establish a new country in Panama so that the United States could build a canal. And
that's right.
That the United States would not have lent. Now, I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been an independence movement in Panama, and they might have won, but the United States lent their support to this independence movement in Panama because its leaders promised to build them a canal, not because the United States was trying to liberate Panama from Colombia.
Teddy Roosevelt said, we took the canal.
Yes.
No, was it we took Panama?
Essentially, we took Panama because, I mean, the first government of Panama was but essentially the first banana republic, which is an important phrase to remember. Banana republic. This term is used pejoratively by Americans to describe the global South. And yet, the original banana republics were set up with American money and the backing of American troops.
That's right.
Panama was the first. After Panama, under Woodrow Wilson, we had the Banana Wars, in which there were large-scale U.S. invasions of Nicaragua, Guatemala, what's now El Salvador. If any of these countries sound familiar to you, it's because they've been in the news during most of our lifetimes over politics that really started with us setting up the first independent governments down there, or to our liking.
Yes.
The reason El Salvador became a separate country is because of the United States playing politics in Guatemala and what's now Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua, and used to just be Guatemala.
And that used to be part of Mexico.
Yes. All sorts of interference and political changes. But the reason they called them the Banana Wars is because these wars were fought for the benefit of the company that we now know as Chiquita Banana.
That's right.
And was at the time the United Fruit Company. C&H Sugar stands for Cuban and Hawaiian Sugar, and is another corporation deeply connected to imperialism and the Cold War. And when you talk about the United States involvement during the Cold War, you're talking about support for the worst gangster governments and the worst Nazis, and the constant repression of the best communists, most of whom were killed or disappeared.
The Communist Party of Venezuela is being repressed.
Yes, the Communist Party of Venezuela is outlawed, are they not?
No, but they're trying. They have this thing called the CNE, which is like the electoral officials.
Yes,
and they decide what a party is and what a party isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And they can decide that this other bunch of people that call themselves the Communist Party of Venezuela are the real Communist Party of Venezuela. And that the old Communist Party of Venezuela that's been there for a century or more is not the Communist Party of Venezuela and can't go on the ballot.
Ah, clever.
Well, it's the LaRouches, I think, are doing some stuff like that to the Communist Party USA.
Yeah, they're really trying hard.
They're setting up fake Twitter accounts of Communist Party of this place, Communist Party of that place.
Yeah. Now, this is the same model that the far right was using to take over the Libertarian Party. They were creating Libertarian Party of such and such accounts. And a lot of those have since become the official accounts as they have successfully taken over state parties. And that's the kind of sort of advanced planning that we're seeing from the LaRouchites. And it's so interesting that they're using the same strategy and that the libertarians seem now to be associating with LaRouchites.
I'm going to have to go.
Of course, I understand.
Okay.
I want to appreciate your time.
I appreciate everything. I appreciate you letting me on. I appreciate what you're doing. And I hope I can help out again some other time.
I hope you have a great rest of the day. I'm glad you're feeling better. I hope you keep feeling better. Let me know if you want to come on again sometime.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Eugene. You have a great Sunday. And folks, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up a little bit in a moment. But what I want to say is what it comes down to is when the State Department says the world is complicated, they're not lying. They're just lying when they then try to tell you, but trust us because the U.S. is good. The political situation in Latin America is one created by an alliance between the ruling class of these countries and American money. And as long as American capital invests in the ruling class of Latin America and makes a profit, then you're going to see these corrupt countries that exist to benefit the ruling class playing the games of U.S. capital. And they won't ever benefit the people as long as that same ruling class is in power. Maduro has been trying to be more neoliberal than Chavez since coming into power, because the neoliberal order is what he needs to make the ruling class that supports him and the middle class that supports it from losing anything more to the poor people who believed what Chavez was selling. And this props up liberalism in South America. And when we support these governments as being socialist when they're not, that creates problems. We should oppose U.S. sanctions. Sanctions make things worse. The sanctions are not the only reason for problems. American capital is the deeper reason for those problems. And that problem will not go away when sanctions are lifted. And that's just something to think about. That's why we need to be doing something about capitalism here as much as about imperialism, because it's the capitalism that fuels the imperialism. And on that note, I hope everybody has a great Sunday, and I'll tweet at you. Bye.